Do you remember the last image you saw of the Israel-Palestine conflict? Was it smoke rising on the horizon, children crying in the rubble, or perhaps a missile streaking across the sky, silent for a second, until it destroyed everything around it? Now tell me, do you truly understand what's behind this? Or do you, like millions of people around the world, only have fragments, clippings of headlines, shallow opinions, and snap judgments? This video will take you beyond the headlines. It will show you what can't fit into 30 seconds of news coverage. What was buried, erased, rewritten. And most importantly, why? What's happening today isn't just a current conflict. It's the explosion of an unresolved history, stitched together with blood, faith, territory, and broken promises. It's an echo that spans centuries, but now resonates with brutal force. With each bomb that falls, a new wound opens. But this wound didn't begin yesterday. It began long before the creation of the State of Israel, long before the Hamas attacks, long before the UN resolutions. The question that echoes now is, why has it never been resolved? And even more frightening, does anyone want to resolve it? In Gaza, more than 2 million people live in one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, under blockades, sieges, and a lack of everything: water, power, medicine. But on the other side, in Israeli cities, sirens blare warning of airstrikes while children run for shelter. On both sides, civilians pay the price for political decisions that no longer seem to be about justice but about power. And you might think, but who started it? The truth is that question lost its meaning long ago, because the history of this conflict isn't linear. It's circular, repetitive, marked by cycles of hate, fear, and revenge. And what makes it all the more desperate, each cycle seems more violent than the last. It's a war of narratives, a war where the losers are always those on the ground, not those in power. The headlines read, "Another attack in Gaza. Israel responds with bombings. Hamas fires missiles." But they don't mention that, behind these short sentences, there are families sleeping in each other's arms because they know they might not wake up. They don't mention that there are children who are more familiar with the sound of drones than laughter. And they don't mention, most importantly, that there are global interests, yes, the interests of other countries, powers, and companies, fueling this chaos. With every armed conflict, profits soar. Arms industries grow, political alliances strengthen, extremist rhetoric gains traction. Suffering becomes currency. Pain becomes a spectacle. And we, on the other side of the screen, watch as if it were a movie. But this movie is real, and it's being rewritten every day with new blood. So, in this video, we'll dive into the root. Go back in time. Understand how we got here. Who promised what? Who betrayed whom? Which lands were taken? Which rights were ignored? Which populations were erased? And why, to this day, there is no peace, only pauses between wars. Are you ready to understand what's really going on? Because this video isn't about taking sides. It's about exposing truths. And some truths hurt more than war. What if I told you that the map of the Middle East has been redrawn dozens of times by people who have never set foot there? That agreements have been signed at European tables without a single Palestinian being heard? And that behind many decisions were oil, trade routes, and political dominance, not freedom, justice, or democracy. The question that will guide you through this documentary is simple, yet powerful. What if you were in their shoes? Stay tuned for the next chapters and discover why this conflict is one of the most complex, manipulated, and misunderstood of the century. And why understanding the past may be the only way to avoid an even darker future. In the mid-19th century, the region known today as Israel and Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, a vast territory stretching from the Black Sea to North Africa. Diverse communities coexisted there: Arab Muslims, local Christians, and Jews living in a few villages. But with the decline of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, 1914 to 1918, European powers saw an opportunity to redraw borders. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 secretly divided the Middle East between France and the United Kingdom. Without consulting the local population, they drew lines on the map, creating colonial mandates. This decision forced distinct cultures to live under the same foreign administration, creating resentments that deepened when, in 1917, the Balfour Declaration promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, without mentioning Arab rights. The ground was ready for a conflict whose roots would be fed by broken promises and the fight for a territory that held religious, symbolic, and strategic significance for the entire world. In the following decades, migratory movements became the spark that ignited the pole. Thousands of Jews fled persecution in Europe and settled in Palestine, purchasing land where Arab families had lived for generations. The local economy changed. Former peasants were displaced by planters and builders. Each new settlement reinforced the sense of threat among the Arab population. Nationalist factions emerged on both sides. In 1929 and 1936, riots and protests gave way to violent repression by British authorities. Meanwhile, in 1939, the United Kingdom declared a limit on the number of Jewish immigrants, in a failed attempt to choose a side in this dispute. But it was too late. Trust had dissipated, and the historical tension became increasingly complex. With the end of World War II and the Holocaust, the tragedy of European Jewry revived international support for the creation of a Jewish state. In 1947, the UN presented a partition plan, dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. For Jewish leaders, it was a chance for reconstruction. For Arab leaders, it meant legitimizing the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. The response was immediate. While the Jewish community accepted the plan with reservations, the Arab League categorically rejected it. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared its independence. The following day, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded the newly created state. This war, the War of Independence for Israelis, the Nakba catastrophe for Palestinians, resulted in the dislocation of 700,000 Arabs, creating the first great exodus. Lands were seized, villages destroyed, families separated. The origins of this conflict, then, are marked by international promises, mass expulsions, and a desperate struggle for survival and recognition. In the following years, the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian control and the West Bank passed to Jordan, while Israel expanded its territory beyond the UN's limits. Between 1949 and 1967, there was relative calm, but this peace kept millions of people displaced, living as refugees. Tensions grew in the shadows, with Palestinian nationalist groups organizing guerrilla attacks from bases in Jordan and Lebanon. Israel, in turn, built settlements in strategic areas with government encouragement. The conflict ceased to be local and began to influence policies throughout the Middle East. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arabism gained momentum, uniting several Arab nations against Israel. The dispute transcended borders. It was an ideological battle, involving not only religion but also disputes over water, trade routes, and geopolitical prestige during the Cold War. We arrive at 1967, the Six-Day War, a turning point. Israel, in just 6 days of fighting, defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, occupying the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and Sinai. It was a lightning military victory, but it paved the way for an occupation that continues to this day. From then on, Israeli settlements proliferated in territories that the international community considers illegal, according to UN resolutions. For Palestinians, that was the moment they lost any hope of a viable state. Brute force drew crooked borders, creating contact zones where violence and disagreements became routine. The stage was set for decades of intifadas, military incursions, and failed negotiations, where each new cycle of violence further widened the gap between two narratives that do not meet. Today, in this labyrinth of stories, maps, and traumas, it's impossible to separate past and present. Every divided street in Jerusalem bears the legacy of ancient battles. Every settlement built on barren rock signals that a political solution never arrived. The borders drawn by distant powers remained, and remain, like open wounds. In the next section, we'll reveal how this long history of disputes and occupations is shaping the invisible cost of the global economy, food prices, the refugee crisis, and the true motivations behind the powers that profit from this war. Prepare to see the present through the lens of its historical roots. Have you ever stopped to think about how an explosion in Gaza or a rocket fired in Tel Aviv reverberates on stock exchanges on the other side of the world? The Israel-Palestine conflict is not just a local human tragedy. It is a cataclysm whose economic, social, and even psychological impact spreads across every continent. Imagine a refinery in Texas reducing production because oil prices are rising. Think of supermarkets in Europe adjusting food baskets while analysts measure how many barrels of oil have been added to the market. See the finance ministers of several countries sweating to contain inflation that rises along with fuel costs. All of this happens because, in this conflict, two of the assets most sensitive to global instability are at stake: the oil route and the supply of grain from the Black Sea. In 2024, data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations indicated that more than 30% of the wheat consumed in the Middle East came from Ukraine and Russia. When Arab countries see grain-laden ships diverted from Ukrainian ports to the Mediterranean, geopolitical tension rises and grain prices soar. And who pays the bill at the supermarket? Ordinary citizens already dealing with stagnant wages. Meanwhile, natural gas, piped through routes that cross or bypass Turkey and the Black Sea, sees its value fluctuate daily, driven by rumors of blockades, pipeline attacks, or additional sanctions. The consequences are direct: higher transportation costs, more expensive energy, rising inflation, and a perfect storm that cripples entire national economies. But it's not just food and energy. Financial markets, sensitive to any uncertainty, move billions in seconds. When an attack occurs, global stock indexes fall, and then recover in a vicious cycle that brings billions of dollars to defense companies. Factories produce missiles and drones, governments sign contracts to renew arsenals, and arms giants celebrate record quarterly results. It's the power of the invisible cost transformed into visible profit. This is the cruel side of a war with no clear protagonist. The death of civilians and the destruction of infrastructure generate a continuous flow of money for those who profit from partial reconstruction, the sale of surveillance systems, and arms exports. Meanwhile, on the streets of Gaza, life continues in extreme conditions. More than 60% of the population depends on humanitarian aid to survive. International organizations estimate that with every missile strike, 2 schools lose their power. With every blockade, hospitals run out of fuel to operate ambulances. Entire families live in makeshift shelters, and a brain drain is inevitable. Doctors trained at local universities seek visas in European countries, leaving the communities that need it most without access to care. The generation that could rebuild the Gaza Strip is abandoning what remains of their homes. And this forced diaspora has unspoken global consequences. Skilled professionals enter the labor market in nations that benefit from their expertise, while the original territory sinks deeper into chronic crisis. On the other side, in Israel, citizens have grown accustomed to curfews, the sound of sirens, and search operations in residential areas. Recent surveys show that more than 40% of young Israelis report high levels of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and insomnia, even without being directly in the conflict zone. Schools are implementing classes on attack preparation and evacuation instructions, and the local economy is facing a decline in foreign investment in sensitive sectors such as technology and tourism. Tel Aviv startups, so celebrated in the international market, are seeing funds postpone investments or redirect capital to locations considered less volatile. Internal political instability, with short-lived governing coalitions and heated debates over national security, increases the sense of unpredictability. The invisible cost is also evident in the refugee crisis. An estimated 5 million Palestinians live outside their lands, many in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. With each retreat of the television cameras, families struggle to survive in tents that have served as their permanent homes for decades. The refugee crisis puts pressure on local government budgets, which, in turn, require loans from multilateral financial institutions, increasing their external debt. This results in public service cuts, protests, and instability that spread to countries that, in theory, are not part of the conflict, but which bear the weight of decisions made thousands of kilometers away in their daily lives. And who profits from all this? Banks financing reconstruction, energy conglomerates negotiating multimillion-dollar contracts, private security companies offering services to risk-averse corporations, and governments strengthening their arsenals in the name of national security. Meanwhile, humanitarian institutions struggle to meet growing demands, with constrained budgets and volatile donations, dependent on the generosity of countries that sometimes freeze contributions due to diplomatic disputes. But the most shocking thing is that, faced with so many numbers, the humanity of the conflict seems invisible. How many of us stop to listen to the story of a teacher teaching in besieged Gaza? Or the story of a Palestinian farmer whose olive grove was uprooted to make way for a settlement? Have you ever considered the voice of an Israeli doctor who, upon returning from the hospital, finds his home in ruins after an enemy attack? These real narratives, in stark contrast to the headlines, are what truly humanize the statistics, and they are what we will present below. Testimonies, quotes from leaders, and direct accounts from those who survive this war every day. Imagine waking up in a world where the next war doesn't need soldiers, where battles are fought in the shadows, over fiber optic cables and hypersensitive satellites, manipulating public opinion and critical systems in the blink of an eye. By 2025, cybersecurity experts are already warning. Attacks on infrastructure, power grids, water supplies, and telecommunication systems could paralyze entire cities before a missile is launched. And all of this fuels the cycle of fear and retaliation, creating a digital minefield that overlaps with the physical conflict in Gaza and the West Bank. This is no fiction. In 2023, a European country's central bank was hacked, attributed to Middle Eastern actors, causing panic in financial markets. If nothing changes, the next escalation could be triggered by a strategic blackout or a leak of sensitive data that destabilizes governments there and beyond. Now, consider southern Lebanon, where armed groups already exchange daily fire across the border. Imagine this crossfire intensifying and drawing Hezbollah into a broader regional war, with Iran supplying long-range weapons and the United States responding with direct support to Israel. The tension wouldn't be confined to a small territory. Civilians in northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and even Damascus could face airstrikes and bombardments. Entire economic sectors dependent on agricultural and tourism exports would grind to a halt. Mass migration would create new waves of refugees heading to Europe, putting pressure on already fragile social systems. And the European Union, torn between supporting tougher sanctions or opening humanitarian corridors, would face internal crises over sovereignty and human rights. What if internationally banned chemical warfare reappears under the guise of controlled gas attacks? In 2018, a chemical attack on British soil reignited the nightmare. If a similar event were to occur in a densely populated area near Jerusalem or Gaza, the global reaction would be immediate, severe sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and possibly military intervention by Western coalitions. But what if the world is too exhausted to react? What if major powers, tired of endless conflicts, decide to turn a blind eye to maintain oil and gas agreements? In this scenario, the victims would be civilians without a press or social media to amplify the horror, leaving silent scars for generations to come. At the same time, analysts predict a rise in radical nationalism on both sides. If extremist parties seize power in Israel or neighboring Arab countries, the previously shaky diplomacy could collapse completely. Peace agreements would become papers thrown to the wind, and any gesture of reconciliation would be used as a domestic political weapon. Authoritarian leaders could justify harsh reprisals as national defense, while opponents would be silenced under the pretext of security. Will young people with no memory of a different era soon become accustomed to war as routine, without questioning alternatives? Finally, there's climate disruption. Water scarcity, rising temperatures, and desertification are accelerating internal migration in Palestine and the Israeli Negev. Competition for basic resources can generate local conflicts that, in an already inflamed territory, quickly escalate. Imagine cisterns drying up while cannons exchange fire just miles away. Who will care for families fleeing the drought even before the attacks? If global powers don't coordinate an adaptation plan, the invisible cost of climate change will add to the economic and human cost of wars, creating a regional collapse. The next war may not need soldiers, and it may already have begun. Amidst the ruins and chaos, sparks of dialogue and cooperation emerge that light the way. Grassroots movements, humanitarian projects, and courageous voices willing to challenge extremist narratives. Organizations like Parents Circle Families Forum bring together Israelis and Palestinians who have lost loved ones in acts of violence to share stories of loss and reconciliation. By listening to each other, they build bridges of empathy that translate into workshops and meetings involving young people from both communities. These encounters, though modest in scale, plant seeds of understanding in the hearts of those who grew up with only the voice of hate. It is proof that when we look into the eyes of those who have suffered, political rhetoric loses its power to turn us into irreconcilable enemies. Economic cooperation projects provide another foundation. Mixed industrial zones in Jericho and Haifa offered joint employment, reducing dependence on foreign aid and creating incentives to maintain stability. Small businesses, supported by international funds, train Palestinian and Israeli traders in sustainable practices and fair trade. When tiles from the same factory pass through the hands of workers on both sides, the logic of profit shares space with mutual respect. While these projects lack the force of an official peace agreement, they act as social laboratories that prove it is possible to coexist for the common good, even in highly contested territory. On the political scene, moderate alternatives are emerging, seeking to revive negotiations that had been put on hold. Initiatives such as the Middle East Quartet, UN, US, EU, and Russia continue to mediate discrete meetings, bringing together delegations willing to negotiate lasting ceasefires and development plans. Furthermore, regional organizations, such as the Arab League, are beginning to articulate more pragmatic positions, encouraging the normalization of relations with Israel in exchange for guarantees of Palestinian rights. This diplomatic game, still fragile, challenges old alliances and pressures governments to reconsider radical precepts to meet basic humanitarian demands. Pressure from global civil society also plays a decisive role. Social media awareness campaigns, petitions, and partial boycotts of products directly linked to the conflict are forcing corporations and governments to rethink their stance. Academics and influencers are promoting public debates, inviting civilians around the world to send letters to political representatives, demanding effective diplomatic action. When thousands of people outside the region demand less sensationalized news and more human escapes, the media is forced to give voice to stories of peace, not just war. This international attention creates a network of spontaneous solidarity, mobilizing donations that fund schools and hospitals in Gaza and the West Bank. In the technological field, innovations are emerging that facilitate dialogue. Multilingual apps bring together volunteers to teach each other languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English, creating opportunities for direct communication without political translation. Virtual reality platforms allow students from Jerusalem and Ramallah to walk together through symbolic landmarks in both cities, feeling a connection that defies physical and mental barriers. These immersive experiences shift perceptions, creating bonds of friendship where previously there was only distrust. They demonstrate that, in the 21st century, technology doesn't need to be a weapon of conflict, but a bridge of understanding. Finally, the voices of young people echo with hope. Student groups, artistic collectives, and cultural festivals in border cities demonstrate that a new generation does not want to inherit the hatred of their elders. Music festivals in Tel Aviv and poetry slams in Gaza exchange tickets and collaborative online performances. Documentaries produced by filmmakers from both sides are screened simultaneously at international festivals, humanizing the other and creating shared narratives. These projects prove that, even in a land of deep scars, it is possible to write a new chapter based on creativity, respect, and solidarity, essential conditions for genuine peace to cease being a utopia. This is the outcome of our journey beyond the headlines. If each seed of dialogue is watered with courage and empathy, historical wounds may one day give way to flowers of reconciliation.